Hey everybody, welcome to week 4 of Jesus and the Gospels. In this week's episode, we'll be talking about how to read the Gospels as literature. So, before you go through this lecture, you might want to read chapter 3 of your textbook so that you can at least keep up with what we're talking about. Otherwise, this lecture isn't going to make much sense. Now, about reading the Gospels as literature. This is the other side of the types of biblical criticisms that we can go through. Again, the word criticism is not a bad term. It doesn't mean we're being mean to the scriptures. All it means is that we are applying the higher critical methods to the scriptures. Now, we've already talked about the historical critical methods, which include text criticism, form criticism, and redaction criticism. All three of those, and there's a couple of others that we didn't talk about, like tradition criticism and things like that. These types of criticisms all address the development of the document itself. They try to figure out what was the original version of the document, or how did the document get stitched together from various sources, or can we detect the author's theological intentions from the way the document was stitched together? On the other side of that coin are the literary critical methods. These methods are those that are more concerned with what the versions of the Gospels we currently have say. For example, narrative criticism cares about things like plot and characters and setting and other parts of the book without asking about how that book or that document came to exist. For example, a literary critic or a narrative critic does not care about the Q source or about the issue of mark and priority. Now, what I absolutely must point out is that the author of your textbook seems to suggest that this is an alternative to the historical critical methods. That at some point in what he calls the recent past, by the way, all of his recent stuff is from the 1960s, come on. All of his comments seem to suggest that people in the recent past have turned away from the historical critical methods toward literary critical methods. That's not the case. This is not an either-or thing where you have to choose whether you're going to be a historical critic or a narrative critic. They can go hand in hand, and I think they should go hand in hand. It really just depends on what types of questions you're asking about a gospel at the given time. So, at no point will I be considering these to be alternatives to the historical critical methods, or even against the historical critical methods. These are a different set of tools that help us arrive at different facts and pieces of information about the Gospels. The good news is, these types of literary critical methods ought to be familiar to you, especially those of you who've just come out of high school. In contemporary American education, most students are regularly asked to identify elements of a story's plot, describe character development, detect the theme of a story. I'm thinking of all those Mississippi high school students who have to take the MAP English 2 exam or the MCT 2 exam for English 2, or even those of you who, God bless you, worked your way through AP English your senior year of high school. You had to be able to dissect a story and identify the plot, the climax, the rising action, the falling action, all those things. You had to be able to identify the characters and who were the main characters, who were the supporting characters. You had to be able to tear apart a story and identify how all these pieces work together. Well, a literary critic, when applying these tools to the Gospels, does the same thing. After all, the Gospels form a specific genre of literature. We talked about this several weeks ago. that has a plot, it has characters, it has a narrative. Now, that narrative may be interrupted by long sermons or speeches, like in Matthew, but the overall framework is that of a narrative. And in fact, it is a predictable narrative. It goes from beginning, whether that's the birth of Jesus or his entry into ministry in Mark, all the way through his crucifixion and resurrection. So we know there is a general framework, a general outline to these narratives. It's how we get there that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John seem to differ. So, the good news is you can probably apply all those skills you did or should have learned in high school to the study of the New Testament. So why is this even a thing? Why are we even talking about applying the higher critical methods from a literary standpoint to the study of the Gospels? Well, it turns out it took a long time for people to get comfortable with treating the New Testament and the Gospels specifically as a type of literature that could be examined like any other story. And you can understand why this is. If the Bible is the Word of God, if it is full of sacred scriptures, then people are going to be hesitant to treat them the same way that they would treat, say, the works of Shakespeare or Edgar Allan Poe or any of the other ancient works that we may have dug up. So we've got to first get over our feelings of indignity when we're studying the Gospels. There comes a time in every believer's life and in every nerd's life when you've got to put aside your subjective feelings about these documents and treat them with some academic objectivity. I personally found that it enriched my faith and my personal devotion by doing so. But that historically took us a lot of blood, sweat, and tears so that we could get to this point. But studying the Gospels in this way does help us because it serves as a supporting technique to things like redaction criticism. For example, studying the Gospels from a literary standpoint helps us understand the intention of the author, which is a link toward redaction criticism. Not only can we address how an author edited his sources to make his gospel and to make a theological point in his gospel, but we can also actually read the text and see what words they used, what sort of narrative structure, what sort of plot, what sort of drama did they weave into this narrative to make a theological point. Secondly, we can detect a theme of a gospel. Your textbook author has already gone to great lengths to try and hammer out some themes of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And that's great. If that helps you remember what the point of those gospels are, great. Mark is a hasty gospel. It's very much just a passion narrative with an extended introduction. Matthew seems to be addressed to a Jewish community because it emphasizes the law and culminates with the spreading of the new Jewish identity made present through Jesus. But whatever the theme is, sound literary analysis of these documents can help us detect it. And finally, this type of analysis can help us see how the Gospels fit into the overall story of the Bible. Very few people in the world take just the Gospels or just a Gospel as their Bible. It's usually a part of a 66-book collection that to them represents the sacred narrative of God's interaction with the world. And so these Gospels form a critical piece to that overall narrative. So, by studying the plot of one of these very important pieces, we may more clearly detect the plot of the overall narrative. Let's go back and remind ourselves about the elements of story. First, every story has an author. Now, for the sake of argument, we're going to assume that Matthew or Mark is the author of their respective gospel. This is what the church has believed, or at least titled these Gospels for thousands of years, and so we're going to play along. My question to you at this point is, would it bother you if we discovered undeniable proof that the person who put together Matthew or Mark or Luke or John wasn't named Matthew or wasn't named Luke or Mark or John? Would it particularly bother you if that was just a title they had given that document? More on that later. We have to assume that there is a real author behind the text. Somebody obviously compiled these documents. They exist, they are real, we have dug them up out of the sand in Egypt. But there is also an implied author. That's the person whom the narrative wants us to believe wrote the document, whether or not they actually wrote it or not. For example, church tradition has believed for a long time that the author of the Gospel of Luke was the physician that traveled along with Paul on his missionary journeys. Now, recent scholarship has pretty soundly debunked that tradition, but yet preachers all the time will talk about how Dr. Luke says so and so. Well, turns out that tradition may be false. Now, we also need to talk about the plot and the setting and the characters of a story. Now, you know what plot is. Plot is progress of the story. Not all the Gospels have the same plot, however. Mark concentrates on the end of Jesus' life and leaves out his birth and childhood entirely. The first page of Mark is when Jesus shows up to begin his ministry when he's already a grown man. However, Luke begins with what we come to know as a version of the Christmas story. Matthew the same way, and then John begins with this crazy, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, dialogue. So they don't all share the exact same plot, but they do all have a plot. We see Jesus growing in some ways. We see him traveling. We see critical encounters between Jesus and his enemies. There is definite plot here. Now, setting is the one that we really need to concentrate on, because the setting is more complicated than just the geography of the story. The setting for any story has to do with the place in which the story takes place. So that's an easy definition. So Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a good example. All those little poems are descriptions of the people seen along the road to Canterbury. And so we understand that the setting of all those little rhymes is the journey from one place to another on the road to Canterbury. In the Gospels, we know that all of these stories take place within the region of Galilee. Some of them start in Bethlehem, some in Nazareth, some in Jerusalem. They take place in real geography, but there's more to it than that. We'll come back there in just a second. Finally, we need to remember what characters are. Those are the people, the creatures, or the elements that play a role in the story. So, some of the characters in the Gospel, obviously we have Jesus, who is the main character of the Gospels. We have individuals like Mary or Joseph or the angel Gabriel, or we have the disciples as a group. We have specific disciples like Peter or James or John or Judas. We have other characters like the Pharisees, or even specific Pharisees like Nicodemus. We have groups of people that are often generalized like tax collectors, but then again we have specific tax collectors like Zacchaeus. We have spiritual characters like demons and angels who have speaking roles in the narratives. Some of them are named, some of them are not named. God Almighty speaks several times in the Gospel, so God is a character, or God the Father, I suppose. All these characters, and there's a big pile of them. The Gospels are just full of characters. They serve different purposes in the narrative. And the more we understand about the characters, well, then the more we can understand about the narrative itself. So a little more about the setting and why it is very important that we understand the setting of the Gospels. It's more than just the dirt and the water or the buildings of the story. We must remember that a story takes place, number one, at a specific place. We've already mentioned this. The story of the Gospels takes place in Galilee or Nazareth or Jerusalem or the surrounding areas. We know the dirt where it takes place. But we also have to remember that the setting takes place in a specific time. Now, within the narrative, you'll have markers for time, like in the reign of Caesar Augustus, while Quirinius was the governor of Syria, we have the birth of Jesus. Then also during the gospel, you'll hear that during Passover, Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And we have all these temporal markers during the narrative. But what's more important, I think, is to remember that the Gospels were written within a specific culture. So, not only do we have to know the geography of the Gospels, but we also have to know the time period in which the Gospels were written. Because, please remember, they weren't written to you. They were written to first century believers in the local churches and Christian communities of the ancient Near East. So, that means that the little phrases, the vocabulary used, the plot structure, the narrative structure, all these things were probably designed to appeal to that audience. Now, am I denying that God Almighty could not have crafted the Gospels to appeal to 21st century believers? No, I'm not denying that whatsoever. In fact, I fully believe that the providence of God can keep the Bible relevant to any generation. But it is important for us to remember that when we read the Gospels, we are peering into a time and place that is alien to us. We might be able to translate the words, but those words may have a different meaning to a local culture. So, we need to remember those three things. First, they were written in a specific place, a specific time, and to a specific culture. That's why the setting is so crucial and requires us to have an extraordinary amount of knowledge of the ancient Near East. So, here's the place where our two categories of criticism intersect. You have to know a lot about the assumptions, the styles, and the ideas of the ancient people of the Bible to understand the symbolism of the setting. For example, when Jesus is taken by Satan up to the Temple Mount, and he's shown all the kingdoms of the world, to us, that might mean that Jesus is taken up by Satan and shown a great vision. Well, in the ancient world, especially to a Jewish believer who had converted from Judaism, you have to remember that the Temple Mount was the highest place in Galilee. It was on the top of the only mountain in Galilee. Therefore, you could go up on top of the temple, theoretically, and see everything. So, little facts like that are difficult for us, or they require an extra layer of knowledge for us. Whereas if we were in the first century, they would just make sense. Oh yeah, he went up at the top of the temple and he could see everything. Well, of course he could, because it's a really high spot. It's like going up on top of the Empire State Building. You can see for miles. So, all that on setting to say that the setting is really crucial, and to a certain point, we just can't know some of what the value of that setting is because we didn't live in that time. Let's talk a little more about characters. We mentioned earlier that you're going to meet a lot of characters in the Gospels. Some of them good guys, some of them bad guys, some of them neutral, some of them are supernatural, some of them are just regular nameless crowds. Some of them are very specific characters that grow and develop over the course of the narrative. So let's talk a little more about characters and what we need to pay attention to. Some players in the story of each gospel are what are called flat, meaning that they are stereotypically good, bad, or neutral. So, this is not always a fair comparison, but in terms of literary style, it is necessary. In general, when Jesus encounters the Pharisees, those are the bad guys, or the Sadducees, or the scribes, or the elders, or the Roman authorities. They are assumed to be the bad guys. Now, there are glimmers of hope. For example, we know that Nicodemus, who shows up to talk to Jesus in John chapter 3, is a Pharisee who seems to be friendly to Jesus. Then we have Joseph of Arimathea after the crucifixion, who is a Pharisee, a member of the Sanhedrin, who comes to claim Jesus' body. I mean, he's obviously a good guy, even though he belongs to one of these bad guy sects. So, flat characters are ones that are easy for us to boo or cheer for. Or sometimes they're neutral, like the crowds, especially in Matthew. The crowds are generally folks that we're not sure if they're good guys or bad guys. They're sort of just in the background observing everything that Jesus is doing and saying. And the intention of Matthew, when he uses the crowds as a literary element, is to invite the reader to see themselves as a member of the crowd. And then, of course, at the end of the gospel, the members of the crowd have to ask, okay, am I going to go into all the world and make disciples and baptize them in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit and teaching them to obey everything that Jesus has commanded? Or are they just going to go on back home? So as a member of the crowd, you have to make that choice. So the crowd is neutral in the actual telling of the story. Now, some characters can grow. They are not flat, nor are they static. They are dynamic or rounded characters who get a little more flesh. They're a little more complex. They get some speaking parts. They have some role in the drama. You know, a great example would be Peter. Simon Peter's one of the disciples, but he's always the spokesman for the disciples. Now, that doesn't always go well for him. He often steps up and sticks his foot in his mouth, or he steps out of the boat into the water, and he does really good for a minute, but then he starts drowning. So you have Peter grows both in knowledge and experience throughout the gospel. Sometimes he does really bad. Sometimes he seems to be doing okay. Then at the end, at the crucifixion, he betrays Jesus 3 times. But then he's, of course, redeemed 3 times also. So Peter would be a great example of a character that is dynamic and rounded, who's complicated. And Jesus doesn't really fit perfectly well into any literary category. On the one hand, he is the hero, because the Gospels are about him. But on the other hand, he seems to have an unfair advantage in that because we know he is portrayed as the Son of God, we have to assume that he's always right. He's not like the heroes of some of your other literary works where they have some critical, heroic flaw that will eventually lead to trouble in the plot. We have to assume that because of who Jesus is, he's going to always do the right thing. Now, he might get crucified for it, but he's going to do the right thing, and he's going to say the right thing, and he's going to win the argument. He's not going to have this crucial flaw that's going to get him in trouble. He's going to, do this thing. For those who may watch Dragon Ball Z, Goku or Gohan they're going to win. You just don't know how they're going to do it. They don't have these fatal character flaws. So Jesus is sort of like that. He's the hero's hero. Can't believe I just referenced Dragon Ball Z in a lecture. All right, the section on rhetoric and all that follows, I'm going to be straight up with you guys. I crossed out a lot of that in my textbook. It's just not worth your time. Let me pick up a couple of the highlights that you need to know. First, chiasm. When you're reading the Gospels, you may come across a chiasm and never even know it. It's named after the Greek letter chi, which looks like a capital X. And the reason it is thusly named is that it follows this wide to narrow, narrow to wide pattern. Um, your textbook tries to explain it. He does a pretty good job. Interestingly enough, chiasm is most often used in Paul. It doesn't show up that often in the Gospels, but when it does, boy, you got to really have a nose to detect these things, or you have to have a list of where they show up. But anyway, a chiasm is where in the narrative a story gets told or a statement gets said, and then a similar event happens or a similar statement is said, and then boom, you get to this really critical core teaching of Jesus, or this really critical event in the life of Jesus or in the life of the disciples, and then you have the same statement that happened just before the critical event is said again, and then the same statement that started the whole thing said again. And so you have this giant X where it started wide and got narrow and then gets wide again afterwards. Kind of tough to notice. It's a literary device that modern authors don't use. They're kind of fun, and when we come across one when we're studying the actual Gospels, I'll point it out to you. All right, so an inclusio and an intercalation. These are mostly in Mark. They're called Markan sandwiches, which sounds really delicious if you're a biblical studies kind of nerd. So a Markan sandwich and these other intercalations are literary devices where stories, not just sentences or events in the narrative, but whole stories, like whole paragraphs or whole chapters, are arranged so that two very, very similar stories make a sandwich with one critical teaching in the middle. So, for example, you may have a miracle story followed by a teaching of Jesus, followed by a healing story, all having the same theme and getting to the same point about who God is or what the kingdom of God is like. And that thing in the middle, that teaching in the middle, makes more sense because of the two stories on the sides. So the sandwich is thusly named because you got the two little stories that are the bread, but then that meaty teaching in the middle. And Mark seems to use this more than the other gospel authors do. Even though Matthew and Luke borrowed material from Mark, they don't incorporate all of his rhetorical style. Now, symbolism. Oh man, symbolism. I mean, we could have a whole class on the symbolism in John, or if you just want to go off the deep end, we could have a whole class on the symbolism of Revelation. Oh, hello. The point is, you can smell symbolism. You can just tell that there's something going on with the certain words or the certain ideas that a gospel author is including in their text. The trouble is, just because we can identify when a gospel author is using symbolic language doesn't always mean we can understand what they mean. For example, when Jesus is talking in parables, which he does all the time in the Gospels, oftentimes we don't exactly know who the characters are lining up with. Is the merciful king who goes off and leaves his workers with talents, and one of them buries his talents in the sand, and the other invests his in the bank, and the other one invests him at a little worse interest rate in the bank. Is the landowner supposed to be God? And are the servants supposed to be the disciples? Well, if so, that last servant who gets punished and gets whatever was given to him taken away, that doesn't bode too well for the disciples. So even though it's easy for us to detect symbolism, we often misinterpret what the symbols represent, again, because we don't live in the first century. Okay, so to wrap up this lecture, let's talk about the grab bag of other critical methodologies that fall into this chapter. I call it a grab bag because it seems like he's just throwing a lot of stuff out there and really trying to impress us. Here's the two that I really want you to concentrate on. First, canon criticism. Canon criticism asks the question, how has the church used this passage or this book? So, canon criticism doesn't particularly care about the historical accuracy or authenticity of a passage. It cares more about how a specific passage or book or portion of the narrative has had a life of its own in the church. For example, a great example is the Christmas story. You would do well to figure out what verse in Luke has the wise men showing up in the manger in Bethlehem. Turns out the wise men do not exist in the Gospel of Luke. However, church tradition has put all the stories of Matthew and Luke together into the Christmas story. So Luke chapter 2 and the first few chapters of Matthew have been welded together into a different narrative, one that combines two completely different documents. And that's fine. That's how the church has used those passages. So canon criticism asks not about the authenticity or liability of a certain passage, but how has it been used in the church? Some more contemporary issues would be how certain passages in the New Testament have been used to prop up things like slavery or things like church politics when it comes to women in ministry or the acceptance of homosexuality in the church. Certain passages have been used by the church in specific ways to achieve certain things or to prop up certain agendas. And that's perfectly fine. It's just how the church has used it. Also, please remember that most churches did not have a copy of the Bible until the 16th century. They were hand copied before that and had to be protected with chains so that people wouldn't steal them. They were all in Latin, and it wasn't until Mr. Gutenberg decided to invent the printing press that more Bibles were able to be printed. And then, of course, Mr. Luther took it upon himself to translate the Bible into the language of the people. And those combination of events really spurred the promulgation of the Bible. And so the church, really in the 16th century, began using specific passages in specific ways rather than just their own traditions in specific ways. And this type of analysis is also a helpful introduction into the Revised Common Lectionary, which the vast majority of churches in the world follow every Sunday, where a selection of 4 passages that have been picked to go together are read aloud in worship. The second of the grab bag of literary methodologies that I want you to know about are liberation and feminist approaches. And not that I am particularly interested in liberation theology. You might be. Gustavo Gutierrez is the father of liberation theology. He wrote The Politics of Jesus, and that was Yoder. A Theology of Liberation is Gutierrez in the 90s. South American liberation theologian who was primarily concerned with reading the Gospels through the eyes of the oppressed minorities in South American countries. Feminist approaches to the Gospels try to go for the same goals, where instead of reading the Gospels as they have always been read, through the eyes, ears, and mouths of men who were the primary preachers and priests and copiers and book authors and all that. The feminist interpretation tries to understand how the gospel looks and sounds and feels through an intentional feminine mindset and frame of reference. And that's fine. It may be helpful for all of us to consider the gospel through these other perspectives and other lenses. These are just techniques that are out there that fall under literary criticism because they do not ask the question, how did this document come to be? They ask the question, how can I analyze the document as it is?